The sky over the Dakota Territory bled in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, a mirror to the soul of a land torn between two worlds. For Jasmine Turner, a woman trapped by the rigid confines of a dusty frontier town, that violent sunset was a prophecy. She was told the plains were no place for a lady, a place of savages and dust. But when she saw the lone Lakota warrior fall a silhouette of strength, undone by a crack of lightning, she didn't see a savage. She saw a man. Her decision to help him was an act of treason in the eyes of her people. But 3 days later, when that same warrior carried her away from the fire and fury of her own world, she would learn the true meaning of savagery, and it had nothing to do with the man whose arms were her only sanctuary. The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that coated the soul. It clung to the hem of Jasmine Turner's dress, dusted the window panes of her father's infirmary, and seemed to settle in the very back of your throat, a constant choking reminder of this untamed place. For Jasmine, who had been raised on the green manicured lawns of Boston, the Dakota Territory of 1876 was a relentless assault on the senses. The wind never ceased its mournful song, and the sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, open sky. Her father, Dr. Alistair Turner, saw opportunity here. He saw a chance to be a vital pillar of a new community, a place where his skills were not just respected, but desperately needed. Jasmine saw a cage gilded with the promise of progress, but built with the bars of rigid expectation. The women of the town, wives of ranchers and merchants, moved with a brittle piety, their conversations a whirlwind of gossip, judgment, and scripture. The men were hard, their faces etched by the sun, and their hands calloused by labor, and often by violence. The most prominent among them was Deputy Marshal Silas Croft. He was a man carved from the rock of the territory itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a winter sky that seemed to miss nothing. He considered himself the town's righteous protector, and his protection extended to what he perceived as its most valuable assets. To Silas, Jasmine was the pinnacle of civilized womanhood, an eastern rose to be cultivated and owned. His courtship was as relentless and suffocating as the dust. He brought her wildflowers that wilted in hours and spoke of a future where she would be mistress of a fine house, her days spent overseeing staff while he tamed the wilderness. He spoke of taming the land and its savage inhabitants with the same possessive gleam in his eye. "The Sioux are a plague, Miss Turner," he'd said just last Sunday after church, his hand lingering on her elbow. "A sickness that must be purged for decent folk to prosper. Mark my words, the army will finish what they started." His words made her skin crawl. She had seen the Lakota from a distance, families trailing through the hills proud and silent. She heard the whispers in town tales of brutality and barbarism, but when she looked at them, she saw not monsters, but a people clinging to a world that was being ripped from beneath their feet. It was this feeling of suffocation, of being penned in by Croft's ambitions and the town's narrow-mindedness, that drove her to ride out alone. Her mare, a gentle bay named Willow, was her only confidant. With the wind whipping her hair free from its tight bun and the endless plains stretching before her, she could almost breathe. She rode further than she should have, beyond the agreed-upon boundaries of safety, chasing the horizon, as if she could outrun her own life. That was when the sky turned. The brilliant blue of the afternoon curdled into a dark, bruised mass of clouds that rolled in from the west with unnatural speed. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with a palpable energy. A storm on the plains was not like the gentle rains of the east. It was a primal, violent thing. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Never get caught in a squall, Jasmine. There's no shelter out here. Panic fluttered in her chest. She turned Willow back toward Redemption Creek, but the town was a mere smudge on the horizon. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy as coins, began to fall. Then she saw him. He was a lone rider, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to meld him with his powerful paint horse. A Lakota warrior. Even from a distance, his presence was commanding. He was riding parallel to her, perhaps a mile to the south, a stark silhouette against the darkening sky. She'd heard the stories from Silas that a lone brave was a scout, a sign of a war party. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She urged Willow faster, her heart hammering against her ribs. The storm broke with a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to split the very heavens. A bolt of lightning, jagged and blindingly white, tore through the sky, striking a gnarled cottonwood tree on a nearby ridge. The tree exploded in a shower of splintered wood and fire. The warrior's horse, a magnificent animal, reared in terror, its scream swallowed by the thunder. The rider fought for control, a master horseman battling a force of nature, but the horse bucked again, a frantic, desperate spasm, and he was thrown. Jasmine watched frozen as his body cartwheeled through the air and landed with a sickening thud on the hard, rain-slicked earth. He didn't move, the paint horse, its eyes wide with fright, and its leg bent at an unnatural angle, scrambled away, hobbling into the maelstrom. The rain was a deluge, now a cold, blinding sheet that soaked her to the bone in seconds. Every instinct, every warning she had ever received screamed at her to ride on. He was one of them, the enemy. Silas Croft's words about a plague rang in her ears. He was likely dangerous, a threat to her very existence. To stop would be an act of utter madness. But her father's voice was there too, a quieter, more insistent whisper from a lifetime of lessons. You do not pass by suffering, Jasmine. Not ever. A life is a life. She watched his still form, a heap of buckskin and beads being pounded by the merciless rain. He was no different from the ranch hand whose leg her father had set last week, or the child she'd helped nurse through a fever. He was a human being, broken and alone. With a cry that was half sob, half defiance, she wrenched Willow's reins, turning the terrified mare away from the distant promise of safety and towards the fallen man. The wind howled, whipping rain into her face, like tiny shards of glass, as if nature itself was trying to turn her back. But her course was set. In that moment, Jasmine Turner was no longer just a doctor's daughter from Boston. She was a woman riding into the heart of a storm, toward a decision that would unravel her world completely. The ground already turning to a slick, treacherous mud sucked at Willow's hooves as Jasmine drew closer. The warrior lay face down, one arm flung out, the other twisted beneath him. The rain had plastered his long black hair to his back and neck. A dark stain was spreading on the earth beneath his head, a mixture of water and blood. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was dead. Dismounting her own movements, clumsy with fear and cold, she tethered Willow to a hardy sagebrush and knelt beside him. "Hello," she called out, her voice thin against the roar of the wind. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. With trembling hands, she gently rolled him over. His face was stark and unconscious, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw now marred by a deep gash on his temple that was bleeding freely. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. He was alive. Relief and a fresh wave of panic warred within her. Her father's medical bag, a smaller version of his own that she always carried on long rides, was strapped to her saddle. It held bandages, laudanum, a needle, and thread, the essentials. Silas Croft would call this treason. The women in town would call it a sin. Her father would call it her duty. She worked quickly, her fear giving way to a focused urgency, she'd learned at her father's side. She tore a strip from her petticoat, an item she was sure the town matrons would deem essential, and pressed it firmly against the head wound to stanch the bleeding. His skin was feverishly hot to the touch. His left leg was bent at a wrong angle below the knee, the bone clearly broken. Getting him back to Redemption Creek was impossible. They would hang him before her father could even set the bone. Leaving him here was a death sentence. The storm would kill him if his injuries didn't. Her eyes scanned the desolate landscape. In the distance, she remembered passing a small, dilapidated line shack, a relic from a failed ranching venture nestled at the base of a rocky butte. It was barely a shelter, but it was something. It was their only chance. Getting him there was a Herculean task. He was heavy, a solid mass of muscle, and she was slight. She managed to get him into a sitting position, his head lolling against his chest. He groaned a deep, guttural sound of pain, and his eyes fluttered open. For a second, they focused on her. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a raw animal pain that stole her breath. Then a flicker of something else, confusion and a deep, ingrained hostility. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "Who?" He rasped the word a harsh whisper. "I'm trying to help you," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She met his gaze without flinching. "You're hurt. I can help." He stared at her for a long moment, his grip unwavering. He was assessing her, searching for the trick, the treachery he had been taught to expect from her kind. She didn't look away. Finally, the fight seemed to drain from him, his body slumping as another wave of pain washed over him. His hand fell away from her wrist. It took what felt like an eternity, but she managed to half-drag, half-carry him to Willow. Getting him onto the mare was an agonizing process of leverage and sheer willpower. He was barely conscious, his weight a deadening burden. With him slumped over the saddle, she led the horse through the driving rain, her own body aching with the strain toward the faint hope of shelter. The line shack was little more than 4 crumbling sod walls and a leaky roof, but it was dry enough. Inside, the air was stale and musty. She eased him off the horse and onto the dirt floor, propping him against a wall. She gave Willow a precious handful of oats from her saddlebag and left her, huddled outside a silent, drenched sentinel. By the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, she went to work. She cleaned and stitched the gash on his head, her fingers moving with a practiced skill. He flinched but didn't cry out. When she examined his leg, a sharp intake of breath escaped her lips. It was a bad break. She found 2 sturdy planks inside the shack and used strips torn from her remaining petticoat to fashion a crude but effective splint, setting the bone as best she could. The act brought a strangled cry of agony from his lips, a sound that twisted her heart, but he bore it with a stoic silence that was both terrifying and admirable. She gave him a small dose of laudanum for the pain, holding a canteen to his lips. He drank greedily. For hours she sat with him as the storm raged outside, wiping his brow when the fever rose, listening to his ragged breathing in the near darkness. They didn't speak. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between their worlds. Yet in that small, broken-down hut, surrounded by the fury of the storm, a silent understanding began to form. It was not friendship, not yet trust, but a shared moment of fragile existence. As dawn approached, the storm abated, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed world. The warrior's fever had broken. His breathing was deeper, more even. He was asleep, his face relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. He looked younger. She knew she had to leave. Staying would be suicide. Her absence would already be noted. Questions would be asked. Silas Croft's possessive, suspicious nature would send him searching. Before she left, she checked his bandages one last time. Her fingers brushed his cheek, and he stirred his eyes, opening. He looked at her, his gaze clear now, the hostility replaced by a weary watchfulness. "I have to go," she whispered. "There is water in the canteen. I will try to come back." He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes followed her as she stood and walked to the door. As she stepped out into the pale morning light, she felt his gaze on her back, a weight she would carry with her all the way back to the lies and suspicion awaiting her in Redemption Creek. The secret was now a living, breathing thing, a dangerous bond forged in a storm. The ride back to Redemption Creek was a torment of a different kind. The physical exhaustion was a dull ache in her bones, but the mental strain was a sharp, piercing anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an accusation. Jasmine rehearsed her story, a flimsy fabrication of getting lost in the storm and taking shelter in a cave. It was weak, and she knew it would barely stand up to the casual scrutiny of her father, let alone the intense interrogation of Silas Croft. As she crested the final ridge overlooking the town, she saw them, a party of riders with Croft at their head. They spurred their horses toward her, and her heart sank. Croft's face was a thunderous mask of relief and fury. "Jasmine, by God, we thought you were dead!" he boomed, reining in his horse so sharply it danced on the wet ground. His eyes swept over her, her torn dress, the mud stains her disheveled hair. "Where have you been? I've had men out all night." I got lost," she stammered, hating the weakness in her voice. "The storm came up so fast. I found a small cave in the bluffs to wait it out." Silas dismounted and stood beside her, his hand gripping Willow's bridle. "A cave, all night alone. Do you have any idea how reckless that was? This land is crawling with hostiles." His concern was laced with a possessive anger that made her bristle. He was reprimanding her as if she were a disobedient child or his property. "I am safe, Deputy. That is what matters." She said, her tone cooler than she intended. Her father was there, his face etched with worry. He simply hugged her, a silent expression of overwhelming relief that made guilt churn in her stomach. He asked no questions on the ride back, for which she was grateful, but she could feel his troubled gaze on her. The next 2 days were a blur of suffocating attention. The townswomen brought pies and condolences, their sympathy dripping with unspoken judgment about her foolish ride. Silas was a constant presence, a self-appointed guardian who shadowed her every move, his suspicion a palpable force field around them. He had searched the bluffs, he told her, and found no sign of a cave that would have sheltered her so well. The lie sat between them, a festering wound. On the 3rd morning, Jasmine knew she had to go back. The warrior she didn't even know his name would be out of water. He would be weak, helpless. The risk was enormous, but the image of him lying alone in that shack haunted her. Under the pretext of needing some air and solitude, she slipped out of town at dawn, pushing Willow at a hard pace. Her heart pounded as she approached the butte. What if he was gone? What if he had died? What if Croft's men had found him? The shack was silent. Willow was gone from where she had left her. She pushed open the creaking door, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. He was gone. The makeshift bed was empty. For a moment, she felt a strange, hollow sense of loss. Then her eyes fell upon a small object, placed carefully in the center of the dirt floor where he had lain. It was a bird carved from a piece of cottonwood bark with painstaking detail. Its wings were outstretched, as if in mid-flight, and the delicate markings of its feathers were etched with a precise, skilled hand. It was a gift, a thank you, a silent acknowledgement of the debt between them. She picked it up the wood, smooth and warm in her palm. He had survived. A rustle in the brush outside made her jump. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. He stood there, leaning heavily on a branch he was using as a crutch. He looked gaunt and tired, but his eyes were sharp. He had retrieved her mare. "You came back," he said. His English was slow, deliberate, but clear. I was worried," she admitted, clutching the carved bird. "Your leg. It will heal," he said, his gaze dropping to the splint she had fashioned. "You have the hands of a medicine woman. My father is a doctor. I learned from him." She took a step closer. "What is your name?" He hesitated, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if weighing the cost of a single word. "My people call me Chayton. I am Jasmine." A silence fell between them, heavy with all the things they could not say. He was the enemy who had accepted her help. She was the outsider who had offered it. "You should not be here," Chayton said, finally, his voice low and urgent. "This land is not safe for you." "Silas the deputy, he says the same," she replied wryly. A flicker of something dark crossed Chayton's face at the mention of a lawman. "He is right, but not for the reasons he believes. The Bluecoats killed many of our women and children on the Powder River. The treaty is broken. The hearts of my people are on the ground. Some of the young warriors, their hearts are now filled with fire and hate. They do not see a white woman. They see only the enemy." He was warning her. It was a reciprocation of her gift, a life for a life. He was paying his debt. "There is talk in town," she said, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "About a raid on the Miller homestead. They say it was your people." Chayton's jaw tightened. "Lies. The Miller land is barren. There is nothing there for us. We do not raid the innocent. But lies are strong medicine. They can make good men do bad things." He took a step toward her, his limp pronounced. He reached out and gently took the canteen from her saddle, a silent request. As she watched him drink, she realized the line between their worlds had blurred irrevocably. He was not an abstract hostile. He was Chayton, a man who carved birds, who spoke of his people's broken hearts, and who was now warning her of a danger her own people refused to see. "Go," he said, handing the canteen back. "Do not come back to this place. Forget you saw me." He turned, and with his makeshift crutch began to move away, melting into the landscape with a practiced ease that belied his injury. Jasmine watched him go, the carved bird clutched tightly in her hand. Forgetting him, she knew, was no longer possible. Returning to Redemption Creek was like stepping from a world of stark, dangerous clarity back into one of murky, veiled hostility. Chayton's warning echoed in her ears, a grim counterpoint to the self-righteous anger simmering in the town. The lie about the Miller homestead raid had taken root and blossomed into a thorny vine of fear and hatred. Men walked the streets with rifles slung over their shoulders, and every stranger was met with suspicion. Silas Croft was at the center of it all, stoking the flames. He organized patrols, delivered fiery speeches in the town square, and spoke of the urgent need for retribution. To Jasmine, his fervor felt manufactured his grief for the entirely fictional, slaughtered Miller family, too loud, too performative. Chayton's words, "Lies are strong medicine," haunted her. She began to observe, to listen more closely. She noticed how Silas met with a slick, well-dressed man named Garrison, who represented a railroad interest from Chicago. She overheard snippets of their conversation, talk of clearing the territory, and unfortunate but necessary sacrifices to secure land grants. The Miller homestead, she discovered through a quiet word with the town's land registrar, sat squarely in the path of the proposed rail line. It was a worthless patch of dirt to a farmer, but a priceless corridor for a railroad. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. The raid was a pretext, a lie crafted by Croft and Garrison to incite a war that would drive the Lakota from their treaty lands for good. Her new knowledge was a heavy, dangerous burden. To speak it aloud would be to accuse the town's heroic protector of being a conspirator and a fraud. Who would believe her, the woman who had foolishly gotten lost in a storm over their stalwart deputy marshal? Her quiet withdrawal and troubled demeanor did not go unnoticed by Croft. He saw her pulling away and mistook it for feminine fragility, a malady he intended to cure with his possessive attention. One afternoon, he found her by the creek at the edge of town, skipping stones across the water. "You're still troubled, Jasmine," he said, his voice softer than usual, but no less commanding. "This business with the savages has shaken you. That is why you need a man to protect you, to make a home with." "Perhaps what has shaken me is not what you think," she replied, not looking at him. His eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Before she could answer, his gaze fell to her hand. She was unconsciously tracing the smooth edges of the carved wooden bird Chayton had given her, which she now kept in her pocket at all times. "What is that?" he asked, his voice sharp. She quickly closed her hand around it. "Nothing. Just a trinket." But he was too fast. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and forced her fingers open. The small, exquisitely carved bird lay on her palm. He stared at it, his face slowly darkening as comprehension dawned. He recognized the style, the precise artistry. It was not the clumsy whittling of a ranch hand. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "I found it," she lied, her heart hammering. "Liar!" he snarled, his grip tightening painfully. "This is Sioux work. I've seen it on their war shields, on their dead. You didn't get lost in a storm, did you? You were with one of them." The accusation hung in the air, venomous and ugly. In that moment, she saw the real Silas Croft, not the protector, but the tyrant, the man who saw possession as love and brutality as strength. Her fear was suddenly eclipsed by a cold, defiant anger. She wrenched her arm from his grasp. What if I was? What if the real savages are the men who invent massacres to steal land? His face went pale, then flushed with rage. He knew she had figured it out. You're a traitor!" he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "A sympathizer. I should have known. You never had the stomach for this place." He stormed away, leaving her by the creek, her wrist throbbing. The secret was out, but she had underestimated the speed and viciousness of his revenge. Within hours, the town had turned on her. Silas Croft, the hero, had been betrayed. He spun a tale of deceit and treachery, painting Jasmine as a Lakota lover who had been passing information to the very savages who had murdered the Millers. The carved bird was his proof. He displayed it in the saloon, a trophy of her perfidy. The women who had brought her pies now crossed the street to avoid her. The men who had tipped their hats now glared with open contempt. The word traitor was whispered behind her back. Doors closed. Friends vanished. She and her father were suddenly pariahs, isolated in a sea of hostility that Croft had whipped into a frenzy. Dr. Turner was bewildered and heartbroken. He confronted Jasmine, demanding the truth. With tears streaming down her face, she told him everything: the fall, the line shack, Chayton, the warning, and her suspicions about Croft and the railroad. He listened in silence, his face aging a decade in the span of a few minutes. "You should have told me," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, not condemnation. "Not because what you did was wrong. It was the most right thing you could have done. But because this kind of secret is too heavy to carry alone in a place like this. The town's judgment was swift and merciless. A sign was nailed to their infirmary door, "Indian Lovers." A rock was thrown through their window that night. Jasmine Turner, once the eastern rose of Redemption Creek, was now its most hated resident, a pariah accused of the ultimate frontier sin. The stage was set for a final violent confrontation, and she was standing at its very center. The hostility that had simmered for days finally boiled over on a moonless, suffocatingly hot night. The air in Redemption Creek was thick with the stench of whiskey and the low, angry murmur of a mob. It began in the saloon where Silas Croft, fueled by drink and a thirst for vengeance, had worked the town's men into a righteous fury. He was no longer just a deputy. He was a demagogue, and Jasmine was his sacrifice. She consorted with the enemy. His voice boomed, carrying out into the dusty street. While we mourn the Millers, she was tending to one of the very beasts who slaughtered them. She is a traitor in our midst, a rot that must be cut out before it poisons us all. Jasmine and her father heard the noise from their small house behind the infirmary. They had been living as prisoners for days, the windows shuttered, the door barred. Dr. Turner held an old shotgun, his hands, usually so steady during surgery, trembling slightly. "They're coming for you, Jasmine," he said, his voice grim. "This isn't about justice anymore. It's a fever. Croft has made them mad." The sound of splintering wood came from the front of the infirmary as the mob broke down the door. Shouts and curses filled the night. They were ransacking the place, destroying the medicines and equipment her father had so carefully assembled. "You have to go," he said, pushing her toward the back door. "There's a horse in the stable. Not Willow, they'll recognize her. Take the old gelding. Ride west toward the Black Hills. Don't stop. Don't look back." "I won't leave you," she cried, grabbing his arm. "You must," he insisted, his eyes pleading. "They want you, not me. I am a doctor. Eventually their fever will break and they will need me again. But you, what they'll do to you." He couldn't finish the sentence. He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. "Money. And food. Now go live, Jasmine. That is all I ask." Tears streamed down her face as she kissed his cheek. With one last look at her father, a brave, terrified man standing guard over their shattered life, she slipped out the back door and into the darkness. The stable was chaos, the animals panicked by the noise. She managed to saddle the old gelding, her fingers fumbling with the straps. She led the horse out, keeping to the shadows of the alleyways. The town was a nightmare of torchlight and angry silhouettes. Her plan was to circle around the edge of town and break for the open plains. But her luck ran out. As she rounded the corner of the general store, she came face to face with a group of men, their faces twisted with hate in the flickering torchlight. At their head was Silas Croft. "Going somewhere, Miss Turner." He sneered, a cruel, triumphant smile on his lips. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The men spread out, forming a circle around her. There was no escape. "We're going to have a trial," Croft announced to the leering faces around him. "Right here, right now, for the crime of treason." He reached for her, his hand like a claw. She flinched back, pulling the gelding with her. The horse spooked by the fire, and the shouting reared up, knocking one of the men aside. It was the only diversion she would get. She scrambled into the saddle, kicking the horse's flanks, desperate to break through the circle. But Croft was on her in an instant, grabbing the bridle and dragging the horse to a halt. He pulled her from the saddle and she fell hard to the ground, the air knocked from her lungs. The men closed in their shadows, falling over her like a shroud. This was it. This was how it ended, in the dirt of a town named Redemption, at the hands of men who had none. Suddenly, A voice cut through the night, sharp and clear, speaking in a language none of them understood. Hokahe. A figure emerged from the darkness behind the general store, moving with a silent, deadly grace. It was Chaitan. He was no longer the injured man she had tended to. He carried a bow, and in a single fluid motion, he knocked an arrow and let it fly. It thudded into the wooden post of the general store porch, inches from Silas Croft's head. The mob froze, stunned into silence. Chaitan moved forward into the torchlight. His face was painted for battle, stark lines of black and red that made his features seem terrifying and resolute. He had discarded his crutch. Though he still favored his leg, he moved with a predator's purpose. Another arrow was already nocked on his string, aimed squarely at Croft's chest. "Let her go," Chaitan said, his English cold and hard as stone. Croft, recovering from his shock, laughed. It was a ragged, incredulous sound. "Look here, boys. Her pet savage has come to rescue her. It's 1 against 20 brave. You have no chance." "Maybe," Chaitan said, his eyes never leaving Croft. "But he nodded at Silas, will be the first to die." The conviction in his voice was absolute. The other men, emboldened by numbers, but cowed by the spectre of their leader falling, hesitated. In that moment of uncertainty, Chaitan let out a piercing war cry. It was answered from the darkness. 2 more Lakota warriors, armed and ready, appeared on the rooftops of the adjacent buildings. The mob's bravado evaporated. 1 against 20 was sport. 3 skilled warriors with bows aimed at them was a death sentence. Croft's face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. He knew he was beaten. With a curse, he shoved Jasmine toward Chaitan. "Take the traitor. She's no good to us anyway." Chaitan moved swiftly. He grabbed Jasmine's arm, pulling her to her feet. His horse, a powerful war pony, materialized from the alleyway. With 1 strong arm, he lifted her and placed her on its back, swinging up behind her in a single, seamless motion. "Hold on," he commanded. He wheeled the horse around, and they plunged back into the darkness from which he had come. The shouts of the mob faded behind them as they galloped out of Redemption Creek, leaving the torchlight and the hatred far behind. Jasmine clung to him, burying her face in his back, the steady beat of his heart, a counterpoint to the thunder of the horse's hooves. She was free from the cage, but she was now an exile, riding into an unknown wilderness with the man who had just declared war on her world to save her. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and sound, the rhythmic pounding of the pony's hooves, the rush of the night wind, and the solid, reassuring presence of Chaitan at her back. Jasmine clung to him, the adrenaline of her escape slowly giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion and a dawning, terrifying realization of her situation. She had fled her home, her father, everything she had ever known. She was an outcast, a fugitive, with her only protector being a man considered an enemy by her entire society. They rode through the night without stopping, Chaitan navigating the dark, rolling hills with an instinct that seemed supernatural. He knew the land, not as a map of lines and names, but as a living entity. He avoided the open ground, keeping to arroyos, and the shadows of buttes, his companions, whose names she learned were Tokala and Eyota, flanking them like silent ghosts. By the time the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky, Redemption Creek was a distant memory, a bad dream swallowed by the vastness of the plains. They finally made camp in a small, hidden copse of cottonwoods near a trickling stream. As Chaitan swung down from the horse, he reached up to help her, his hand strong and gentle on her waist. The moment her feet touched the ground, her legs gave way, trembling with fatigue and shock. He caught her, holding her steady. "You are safe now," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The 2 other warriors kept their distance, their faces impassive, but their eyes filled with a clear, unwavering suspicion. Tokala in particular watched her with open hostility. He was broad and powerfully built, his face a mask of fierce pride. He spoke to Chaitan in their native tongue, his words sharp and guttural. Jasmine didn't need to understand the language to grasp his meaning. She was a liability, a danger. Chaitan's reply was low and firm, ending the conversation. The days that followed blurred into a grueling routine of survival. This was not the romantic wilderness of the books she had read back east. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape that demanded respect and resilience. Chaitan became her teacher. He showed her how to find water, how to identify edible plants, and how to move silently through the brush. He taught her how to read the signs of the land, a bent blade of grass, a disturbed pebble, the flight of a hawk, all of which told a story to those who knew the language. The journey was a constant, gnawing hardship. The sun was relentless, the nights were cold, and her body ached with a weariness she had never imagined possible. Yet through it all, a profound transformation was taking place. The constraints of her old life, the corsets, the petticoats, the suffocating etiquette were stripped away. She wore a pair of buckskin trousers and a loose tunic that Chaitan's companions had provided practical garments that allowed for freedom of movement. The dust and sun colored her skin, and the hard travel strengthened her body. She was becoming a part of the landscape, no longer a visitor, but a dweller. Their bond deepened in the quiet moments. They shared meals of roasted rabbit and wild onions, sitting by a small, smokeless fire. He told her stories of his people, of the star beings, and the great mystery, painting a picture of a world rich with a spirituality she had never known. She in turn told him of Boston, of great buildings that touched the sky, and ships that crossed the endless water. It was a clumsy exchange of two impossibly different worlds, bridged by a growing, unspoken affection. One evening as they rested, she tended to a cut on his hand, her touch gentle and practiced. He watched her, his dark eyes tracing the lines of her face in the firelight. "Your hands still know the medicine," he said quietly. "It is all I have left of my father." She replied, her voice thick with emotion. The thought of her father alone and facing the town's wrath was a constant aching pain in her heart. "He is a strong man," Chaitan said, as if sensing her thoughts. "He faced the mob for you. He has a warrior's heart." His words were a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. The journey was not without peril. One afternoon, Ayota, the younger, sharper-eyed warrior, spotted a dust cloud in the distance. Trackers. It had to be Silas Croft, his hatred and obsession driving him far beyond the jurisdiction of Redemption Creek. They scrambled, leaving no trace of their camp, and rode hard for the Badlands, a maze of canyons and twisted rock formations where they could lose their pursuers. It was during this desperate flight that Jasmine's horse stumbled, throwing her to the ground. She landed hard, a sharp, searing pain shooting through her ankle. She tried to stand, but a cry of agony escaped her lips. Chaitan was at her side in an instant. Tokala scowled, muttering that she would be the death of them all. Without a word, Chaitan examined her ankle. It was already swelling. She would not be able to ride. The trackers were closing in. For the first time, Jasmine saw a flicker of fear in Chaitan's eyes, not for himself, but for her. He made a decision. He spoke rapidly to his companions, who nodded and split off, heading in different directions to lay false trails. Then he turned to her. He lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, and placed her in front of him on his own horse. Her body was pressed against his, her head resting against his shoulder. "I will not leave you," he said, his voice a fierce promise against her ear. He urged the horse forward into the labyrinth of the Badlands. He held her securely, one arm wrapped around her waist as he navigated the treacherous terrain. She was exhausted in pain and terrified, but in his arms she felt an overwhelming sense of safety. He was her shield against the harshness of the world. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the canyons, she was too weak to sit up any longer. He shifted her, cradling her against his chest as the horse picked its way through the rocks. The title of the story she was living became reality. He carried her across the plains, his strength, her only salvation, his presence, her only home. They traveled for what felt like an eternity through the winding, sun-baked canyons of the Badlands. Chaitan's knowledge of the terrain was their salvation. He led them through narrow passages and hidden trails that would be invisible to any pursuer, his relentless pace finally shaking Croft's trackers. When at last he was certain they were safe, he found a secluded alcove sheltered by an overhanging rock where a small spring seeped from the stone, nurturing a patch of vibrant green moss. Here they could finally rest. Tokala and Ayota rejoined them the next day, their expressions grim but relieved. They had been successful. The trail was cold. Croft and his men would have no choice but to turn back, defeated by the wilderness they sought to conquer. In the relative safety of the alcove, the forced intimacy of their flight gave way to a quiet, profound connection. Chaitan tended to Jasmine's ankle with a gentle expertise, binding it with cool leaves that eased the swelling. The animosity from Tokala lessened, replaced by a grudging respect. He had seen her resilience, her refusal to complain despite her pain and fear. He had seen Chaitan's unwavering resolve to protect her. She was no longer just a white woman. She was Chaitan's white woman, and his loyalty to his friend overrode his prejudice. As Jasmine healed, the question of their future loomed large and unspoken. She could never return to Redemption Creek. Her life there was over, burned away by the fires of accusation and hate. But neither could she simply enter Chaitan's world. Her presence in his village would be a source of immense danger and division, a catalyst for the very conflict he fought to avoid. She would be a constant living reminder of the broken treaties and the encroaching white world. One evening, as the stars emerged, a brilliant, glittering canopy in the clear desert sky, Jasmine finally gave voice to the question that haunted them both. "What happens now, Chaitan?" He was sitting beside her, sharpening an arrowhead with a piece of flint. He paused, setting his work aside. He looked not at her, but out at the vast, silent landscape stretching before them. "My path is with my people," he said, his voice heavy. "The fight is not over. The men like Croft, the men who build the Iron Road, they will not stop. I must stand with my family." Jasmine's heart sank. She understood. She had always understood. His duty, his identity, was woven into the fabric of his tribe. There was no place for her in that tapestry. "I know," she whispered, her gaze falling to her hands. "I would never ask you to choose." He then turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. "But my heart, it now walks a different path, a path that leads to you." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. "I have thought of a place, a hidden valley many days' journey from here. The water is sweet and the game is plentiful. It is not Lakota land, and it is not white land. It is in between, a place where we could be for a time." It was not a promise of forever. It was not a solution to the war that raged between their peoples. It was a temporary peace, a borrowed time, a sanctuary carved out of a world that had no room for them. For Jasmine, who had lost everything it sounded like heaven, before they could leave, however, the past had one last card to play. Eyota, scouting the perimeter, returned with urgent news. A small party of soldiers was nearby, and they had a prisoner, a white man, Dr. Alastair Turner. They learned that after Jasmine's escape, Silas Croft's authority had crumbled. His failure to capture her, coupled with the growing suspicion of respected town elders about the convenient Miller raid, led to an investigation by the territorial marshal. Garrison, the railroad man, had vanished, leaving Croft to face the consequences alone. His lies unraveled, and he was exposed not as a hero, but as a manipulative villain who had nearly incited a massacre for profit. In a final desperate act, he had taken Dr. Turner hostage, fleeing into the wilderness. Chayton Jasmine and the two warriors found them making a cold camp. Croft was a broken man, his arrogance replaced by a wild, cornered animal desperation. He held a pistol to Dr. Turner's head. "Stay back, savage," he screamed when he saw Chayton. "I'll kill him." Jasmine stepped out from behind the rocks. "Let him go, Silas," she said, her voice clear and strong. Croft's eyes widened, a crazed look on his face. This is all your fault. You and your filthy lover." In that moment of distraction, as Croft's attention was fixed on Jasmine, Chayton acted. He was not a lawman seeking justice. He was a warrior protecting his own. The thrum of his bowstring was the only sound. An arrow sprouted in Croft's shoulder, causing him to cry out and drop the pistol. Before he could recover, Tokala and Eyota were on him, disarming and subduing him. Karma had found Silas Croft, not at the end of a rope in a civilized town, but in the dirt of the wilderness. He had tried to tame his power, stripped away by the very people he despised. The reunion between Jasmine and her father was a torrent of emotion, a desperate, clinging embrace. Dr. Turner looked at Chayton, not with fear or hatred, but with a profound, weary gratitude. "You saved her twice," he said, his voice thick. "My life and my daughter's. I am in your debt." They left Croft tied up for the soldiers to find. His fate was sealed. But the problem of their own future remained. In the end, they journeyed to Chayton's hidden valley. Dr. Turner went with them. His life in Redemption Creek was as finished as his daughter's. The three of them, a strange and unlikely family, built a small cabin by the stream. It was a life of hardship and simplicity, but it was a life of peace. A life of their own making. It wasn't an end to the story, but a new, uncertain beginning, a fragile sanctuary held together by courage, loyalty, and a love that had defied a world determined to tear it apart. The story of Jasmine and Chayton isn't just a romance. It's a testament to the idea that our shared humanity can be a light in the darkest of times. They lived in an era defined by hatred and division, where the lines between worlds were drawn in blood. Yet they chose to see the person, not the label. Their journey across the plains was more than a physical escape. It was a journey toward a new kind of freedom, one they had to build for themselves when the world offered them none. Their love story reminds us that true strength isn't about conquering others, but about having the courage to connect, to protect, and to choose a different path. If their story of defiance and love moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story of courage against all odds, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more tales that explore the depths of the human heart. Thank you for listening.